All right, hello freshmen. I hope you all are having a great day. I wanted to hop on here and just give you a brief lecture on primary and secondary sources. Some of you may already know what these are, but we're just going to do a really short lesson kind of going over the difference between the two and how we will use them in this class. There will also be a short, brief lesson at the end. That's the first part of a two-part lesson that we will complete on Monday. So this course is organized around daily inquiries, meaning every single lesson that we do, or at least most of them, will be attempting to answer some sort of question about history. And oftentimes they will build throughout the unit, right? So they get more and more complex. Today's daily inquiry is what is more reliable for understanding history, primary or secondary sources? I'm going to go ahead and present this now. Okay, so the first thing that we do when we're talking about these types of questions, and this is the process that we will use repeatedly throughout the class, is breaking down the question. So you read the question 2 times, you underline the important terms within the question, you define those underlined terms or like figure out a synonym or a different way to say that word, and then you rewrite the question in your own words. The purpose of this is because it helps us to really understand what the question is asking us before we get into the lesson, so that we can really get our brains tuned in to what we are trying to learn in the lesson. So the way we would do that with this question is reliable, history, primary, and secondary is supposed to be underlined. Those are the really key big terms in this question. So reliable, a synonym for that could be trustworthy. History, when we're trying to understand history, we're trying to know what happened in the past and try and figure it out. A primary source, for those of you that don't know, is a source created during the time period of study by someone who experienced the moment. And a secondary source is a source created later in history using a variety of primary sources. So if we rewrite that question, the question is really asking us, what is more trustworthy in helping a person to learn about what happened in the past? Sources that were created in the moment by someone who experienced the event, or sources created later on in history by someone using a variety of primary sources. So that's what we're trying to figure out in our little mini lesson. Quick side note, one thing you will learn about me very quickly is that I am a horrendous speller. I can proofread something 3 times and there will still be mistakes on it. So I make all these worksheets and all these PowerPoints, so there will always be typos in it. I apologize, I proofread, it happens. It's okay. We'll all survive together. Okay, so primary sources. As I previously stated, primary sources are original evidence of the event or time period. They're materials created by a participant of the event, or materials created during an event. So big examples of primary sources include drawings, memoirs, objects, letters, newspapers, paintings, diary entries, photos, court testimonies, or government records. All of these things would be created during that moment in time, right? So if, a woman writes a letter to a man who's fighting off in World War II, that letter was created while World War II was going on, which is what makes it primary. If we are reading a court testimony from a court that took, or from a trial that took place during the Industrial Revolution, that court testimony was given during that time period, all right? Newspaper articles also, if a newspaper article is written during a time period about an event that took place at that moment, that is a primary source. The advantages of primary source are abundant, right? The purpose is often very clear and specific. We know why newspaper articles are written oftentimes. We know why people write letters to other people. You really get unfiltered access to an event in a way that secondary sources don't give you. And you know the who, the what, the where, the when, most of the time, not all the time. But there are some disadvantages. The perspective of the author could impact the information. This is what we call bias. You guys have probably heard this term before. Everybody and everything has bias, right? We all have our own perception. And we're going to talk about this more at the end of the lesson and on Monday. That impact how we tell stories and how we experience events. It's not lying, right? But it does impact it. Sometimes these documents are very old. They may be unclear or hard to read. The author is oftentimes dead, right? So we can't go ask that person what they were talking about. And primary sources give us a very narrow view of an event, right? So we might read, like I said, a letter from a woman to a man or a man to a woman during World War II, and it is only going to tell us about that specific moment in history. So we might read a primary source and learn about one battle of World War II, very specific moment in history. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are evidence gathered secondhand. So this is not based on a person's first-hand experience. This includes textbooks, history books, articles about the past that are written today. There are a lot of advantages to secondary sources. They're often written by history experts. They give us access to many primary sources because these history experts use primary sources to inform their telling of the story. And instead of learning about a very specific thing, we can learn about a really broad topic, right? So instead of reading a letter from a specific battle in World War II, we can read a book about all the battles of World War II and get a much broader overview instead of only learning about that very specific moment. But there are some disadvantages, just as there are with primary sources. It may not have all the information. The author may have conducted poor research. And just like what we talked about with primary sources, the author who is writing this book or this article or this textbook, they are trying to convince you that their interpretation of the past is correct, and it may not be. So you have to be aware of that when you're reading secondary sources, right? There may be things in it that are factual, but there is an argument that this person is trying to convince you of. So you need to be aware of that. So what do you think about our daily inquiry? Which is more reliable to use, primary or secondary sources? You can write it down in the notes that you're supposed to be keeping, whether that's on a notebook or a Google document. You can pause the video and just take a sec to reflect on your thoughts. The answer, drum roll, boo, is that both are reliable. Both primary and secondary sources have advantages and disadvantages. Both have bias. Both can be very helpful. The important thing is knowing when and how to use both primary and secondary sources to help shape our knowledge of history. And that is really what we're going to do in this class and what we're going to learn how to do more efficiently and with better judgment. So now what you're going to do is complete the assignment, Lunchroom Fight Part 1. So you just watched this lecture, you're still watching it, obviously. And so the next assignment is meant to build off our understanding of primary sources. We're going to be using a lot of primary sources in this class, and so we have to understand how to use them and what their limitations are. What can they tell us, and what are they maybe not telling us? I'm going to do that if I can. Okay, so every single person has a unique perception, right? They experience the world in unique ways based on their gender, race, religion, social class, family values, etc., right? There's all these different things that make a person who they are. This means that each individual person experiences a historical event differently than another person based on their unique situation. One person may remember an event very differently than another person. You yourself may have experienced this with your own family or friends. I usually do an activity, when we're in the classroom, where we tell stories, and then we try and memorize our partner stories and things like that. But it's clear, everybody has that moment or that story where, maybe it was you and your sibling, right? You both experienced the same thing, but you remember it very differently. This happens in history as well. When a person is writing a diary or newspaper article or letter, their individual perception of an event will impact how they tell their story. That doesn't mean they're lying, but it is something that we as historians need to be aware of when we're trying to figure out what actually happened in the past. So for this short little assignment, you imagine that you are a principal of a school and you just found out that there was a fight in a lunchroom during lunch. You've asked many students and teachers who witnessed the fight what they saw so you can figure out who started it. Unfortunately, you've received many different accounts that disagree about who started the fight, who was involved, and when it started. It's important to remember that no one is outright lying. So you're going to go ahead and take some time to answer these 3 questions. How could there be different stories of an event if no one is lying? Who are the different people who might have been and seen this fight? Example, friends of people who were involved. And what might make one person's story more believable than another person's story? Your answer should be in complete sentences. And yeah, you'll turn this in on Canvas. That is all I have for you guys for this lesson. So I will talk to you all on Monday.